I love New York City. I had an apartment here for some years, and I miss it dreadfully. But whenever I'm here, I feel extremely welcome. Like every person who first comes to Manhattan, I feel that electricity coming off the sidewalk up into my feet. It energizes me. Otherwise, I should be fast asleep because I've been kept on a tight leash today, doing all kinds of extraordinary interviews with somebody called Charlie Rose, who's very nice, and various other people. Some man from WNYC, which is an NPR station, terribly nice fellow, called Leonard. And we talked about my book, and he said we haven't had time. We haven't had there's so much in your book we've not talked about. He said we've not had the drink, we've not had the friendship, we've not had Laurie, we've not had sex, we've not had this. I said, I promise we'll have sex next time we meet. He said, that's great. Oh my God, what have I just said? So at least I've got a date. I'm going to take my scarf off because as attractive as it is and charming as it is, it's quite warm in here. And I like to think the warmth is the warmth of a very welcoming New York crowd here. It's very Barnes of you to be here. I mean, really, it's very noble of you. And I always feel, as a writer, as I suppose must, especially a writer who is other things, there's a primary act of arrogance in believing that any word that you commit to paper or to a screen that eventually becomes in some form published is worth reading by other people. And we live in an age, indeed, in which more and more people are writers. Indeed, probably every one of you in this room, if not everyone, 98% of you, is a writer to strangers every day. So most of us now have in common the experience of writing, whether it be in the form of 140-character tweets or updates of Facebook status, or whether it be in blog form. It has become perhaps a less unfamiliar experience to put down your thoughts in words and transmit them to strangers, which is what the act of writing is. Now, to me, and I think the greatest blessing I ever had is I love music with a passion that I could not possibly express properly. I have Van Gogh's ear for music. How do you pronounce it Van Gogh? And we pronounce it Van Gogh. In fact, it's Van Gogh. His name should be pronounced. I suppose we've just decided on a wrong pronunciation. I mean, we can fight over whose is wronger. But anyway, I have Van Gogh's ear for music, sadly, and I can't dance. I can't play sport, and I never could as a child. And I always felt I felt uncoordinated, and I felt I had nothing except the one thing that we all have in this room. I'm hoping we all have, because otherwise we'll need a signer, and that is the ability to receive language through our ears and through our eyes if we can read. It is such a peculiar and extraordinary miracle, language, and it is the greatest miracle, I think, of our species, and the one we most take for granted. It's only about 50,000 years ago that as a species we developed the ability to do more than simply communicate by grunts and gestures, and to suggest time, which I think is the key thing about language. The fact that you can have futurity. You can actually say, I'll see you tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow. Now, no bonobo or chimpanzee or octopus or dolphin or any other mammal or creature of intelligence has ever been able to express a sense of time, future. Has ever been able to plan, has ever been able to transmit knowledge to the next generation and to pick up knowledge from the past generation. And that is what civilization is. It's language. Everything we have is language. And so one of the things I realized as I was preparing to write this autobiography, having moved on from my childhood, which was one of a great deal of Sturm and of not a little amount of Drang. I was expelled from several schools. I went to prison. So I want you to picture me there, straw, bars of the prison as shadows on me, rats crawling over me, at age 18 with no future, and deeply upset, obviously, parents who loved me very much and who were bewildered by my antics and my peculiarity, and I find this was quite difficult because my mother's beloved cousin is sitting reminding me of her very much, and making me sure that I don't accidentally say the word fuck. Oh! There you go, you see? That's what happens. That's the imp I've always had in me. It's too much for me to, I'm not going to read from the book. There are too many of you, really, for if everyone does want to get a chance to say a quick hello for me to sign the book, for me to talk for too long, or to read a great passage from the book. Obviously, Barnes and Mrs. Noble and the whole Barnes family and the whole Noble family are relying on you buying the book in some form, and it would be nice if you did so. And we'll meet there briefly, and I'll sign for you, of course, happily. But in the meantime, I thought rather than directly reading from the book, I could just talk about that extraordinary feeling that the book covers, really, which is from being in prison and realizing that I had severely screwed up my childhood, that something horribly wrong had happened. I can look back at it and I can try and presume to understand. I'm sure most of the people in this room, when they were teenagers, felt they lived in a kind of republic that was uniquely theirs, and it was misunderstood by everyone else around them, and that they were sort of simultaneously ashamed and proud of being teenagers. They wanted to stay teenagers for the rest of their lives, and they wanted to escape the burden of being a teenager instantly. That strange pull is part of what the agony of adolescence is. But for me, it was language that was my form of escape. I think from a very early age, I was aware that my sexuality was not the norm. I think it was probably, actually, with respect to my dear cousin here, I think it was when I was being born. I remember looking up and saying, that's the last time I'm going up on a I don't think it came as an enormous surprise to my mother when I came out to her as the fagular of the family. And so it turns out I'm not the only fagular of the family. It was a relief to know that. You have to cast your mind back. Those of you young who find it hard to believe that there was a time when the world was full of manic fundamentalist people who had weird faith and a strange lack of understanding, and the world was full of bigotry. It's hard to imagine the time, but there was. But particularly, I think, growing up in England, in the middle of the country. My cousin will testify that the country house in which I grew up was a grand and fine house, but it was colder inside than it was outside, and it had no central heating and relied on fires and the odd servant, if we were lucky enough to have them, to keep it. It was a large and rambling old place, and it was miles from anywhere. Miles from anywhere. One day, the mobile library would come once every other Thursday. And the library was like a van, like a pantectic, I don't really call it in America. I don't know a van, I guess. And it had bookshelves on it, and it was driven by this formidable lady who would then park it at the corner of the lane about a mile from the house, and then she'd go around and unlock the side door and go in and behind the counter, and you would pick a book and she would stamp it, and you'd take out 3, 4, 5 books, however many it was. Now, my parents are both graduates, and my father was a scientist, and my mother read history at university. They both I grew up in a house full of books. I was also, from the age of about 10, pretty much an insomniac, and there wasn't any television to be had. It closed down in England around about 9 o'clock. It had been considered at the time far too late for anybody else to watch television. I knew in America they had things called the late show, the late show, the late show, the late show. Good morning, I can tell you how envious I was. But I had books. And I read them. And it was around the time that I had these sort of strange stirrings that I was different from other people. That I saw a film in these tiny little black and white television that we were allowed to have in the house. It was kept in the corner of the room somewhere, like it was a disgrace. And it was an old film directed by my uncle Anthony Asquith, known as Puffin Asquith, for those of you who are film buffs who know who I mean. And it was the film The Importance of Being Earnest. which is based on a play, of course, by Oscar Wilde. And I think I'd probably heard of Oscar Wilde. I think my mother would have. I know she did. She had a copy of these fairy tales, these extraordinary tales that he wrote for his two sons. Beautiful, some of the most beautiful stories ever written. Wilde's fairy tales, and I could, if I wanted, have this whole room in tears by reading two of his stories to you now. And I would love, on some other occasion, because it gives me great pleasure to read his story. But I had no idea about this play, and I sat and watched it. It had Michael Redgrave and David Evans and Michael Dennison and others in it, and I didn't really know what was going on, except that something was exploding in my head because of the language. There's a moment where Algernon says to Cicely, would you be in any way offended if I said that you seem to me to be the absolute personification of absolute perfection? And she looks at him and says, no. And there's another bit where she says, oh, how blue your eyes are, Jack. They're quite blue. It's a simple phrase, isn't it? But I was somehow ready. I was ready to understand that language was more than the thing you just used to say, pass the salt, or I'm angry, or deliver me a pizza, or where's the nearest toilet. Language could dance in your mind. It could make you, it could seduce you, it could beguile you, it could enthrall you. It could come up with sentences like, would you be in any way offended if I said that you seem to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection? And so I watched it with my mouth open, absolutely astounded, memorizing phrases as they came into my head, because I'd never heard any speech used like that before, with such bounce and rhythm and grace and such incredible wit. And so the following Thursday, the mobile library came, and I rushed into it, and I said to the stern lady, who in my mind was like a Ruffensbrook wardress, but she was probably very nice. And I said to her, have you heard of someone called Oscar Wilde? She said, yes, dear. I said, well, there's a play called The Importance of Being Earnest. Yes. Have you got it? She said, well, we got, yes, we have. And there it was, The Importance of Being Earnest. So I pulled it out, and I ran home with it. And she stamped it. I ran home with it. And I read it, and I think I learned it off by heart to this day. Did you hear what I was playing on the piano just now? Playing? Making it polite to listen to. I'm sorry for that, Dane, for your sake. You do not play accurately, anybody can play accurately, but that play with wonderful expression. As far as the piano goes, sentiment is my forte. And so I literally do the whole play for you. Not that you would want that. And so 2 weeks of reading it and reading nothing else, I go back and I say, is there anything else by Oscar Wilde? And she said, well, there's that book there. And it said The Complete Works of Oscar Wilde. So I took that, and I kept that for 4 weeks. Stamped it, came back to it, stamped again. I read everything in it, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. I was simply bowled over. Suddenly, something had me in its grip that I just knew my future lay in this extraordinary process of one word being put after another and being able to do something in someone else's mind. It was like being able to spread a disease only with a benign one. simply by the stroke of a pen, or in the case of speech, the tip of the tongue hitting the front of the teeth. You can cause joy and delight in people. It's an extraordinary thing. And we all have it. Every one of us in this room has it. It's an utter mystery as to where it comes from. We think it may be the FOXTP gene. We think there's this element here and that element there. But it's something we have, and it's something we take for granted. So I went back after this second session of having the works of Oscar Wilde. I said, have you got anything else by Oscar Wilde? She said, darling, The Complete Works. I said, you must have written something else. And she looked at me and she said, how old are you? I think I was 10 or 11. I said, 14. She said, And I could see her mind was going through some very, very odd process. And she said, I shouldn't be doing this. And she plucked a book out. It was called The Trials of Oscar Wilde by L. Montgomery Hyde. And it told the story of the man. And I read about him. I read about this giant of a man. I was felled so terribly and suffered so appallingly. And I also realized that I shared what he had, what he called his nature, was also my nature. And it was both a wonderful feeling that I was connected to the greatest writer I had yet read. I was like him, but it was also an awful feeling that I was bound for the same destiny. I was doomed, as he was, to be a shame and a ruin and a despair. I was to be an outcast, a pariah, to be despised and rejected of men, because that's what people like Oscar Wilde were. There was a king, King George V, as played by Michael Gambon in the film. The King's Speech, you may remember, he dies. It's a rather good death scene. George V was not a nice man. He was the son of the Edward VII, and there was a Duke of Westminster who was forced to flee to France for having had an affair with a footman or something similar, and the press got hold of it, and George V said, well, we haven't seen old Westminster for ages. Where's he? Someone said, oh, well, Your Majesty, he had to go to Paris. There was something to do with a page or a footman. And there was a big pause, and George V said, I thought men like that shot themselves. Extraordinary remark. I'm afraid that was the world that was lived in. I thought men like that shot themselves. So I had a double feeling about writing, but what I knew was that it was my destiny to find out more. And so I would cycle the 12 miles to the nearest town where there was a proper library, and I looked up more of Wilde and more of Wilde's friends, and I by accident became a lover of literature, really, because it was the musical tones, the beauty, the wit, the grace of Oscar Wilde's style and his life and the way he lived his life. And it was also the connections I made from one writer to another, like a chamois jumping from crag to crag. Suddenly then I discovered this writer and that writer and the other writer, and suddenly writing seemed to me the most important and exciting thing in the world. And it unfortunately happened that by the time I was about 14, I fell in love, and love, as many of you in this room know, is the most disruptive influence, the most dreadful and awful and wondrous thing. And in my case, it sent me pretty loopy. And I haven't really settled down yet. And I hope I never will. But so the figure, really, I would leave with you. The book, I suppose I hope to tell you, in case you're going to buy it. I don't want you to buy, as the English phrase is, a pig in a poker. The book covers this period from prison to when I decided to perk myself up a bit and maybe use the brain that nature had clearly given me, which, if not, in fact, it was a Don at Cambridge University. I went to. Don is a name for a teacher at the ancient universities. He said to me, he said, you've got a really remarkable brain, Mr. Fry. He said, a quite appalling mind. I couldn't work out whether to be pleased. I was glad I had a nice brain, and I thought I wanted a nice mind as well. So I've tried to work on my mind, because the brain is not a moral quality. Never forget that. Intelligence is not a moral quality. Memory is not a moral quality. Knowing how to add up is not a moral quality. Being able to quote is not a moral quality. Kindness, cheerfulness, these are moral qualities. These are things we can work on. These are things we can be proud of. I'd rather have he was cheerful on my gravestone than he could quote the whole works of Shakespeare, or he was the most, he had an IQ of 172. I would rather have he was friendly, he was kind. And those are the hardest things, and they're such small, simple little words. But I am lucky to come from a family that was kind, that had, is the Jewish word is, it had nachas, it had warmth and friendliness and kindness at the heart of it. So I survived what many other children would not have done, prison and disgrace, and was able to pull myself up. Or how does Tennyson put it in Memoriam, to rise above to rise above the spirit of my dead self on the stepping stone of higher things, or something like that. And I managed to get a scholarship to Cambridge University, where I met a group of people who were also students, and I got into this acting lark, which the first, I met this, I saw a production of Travesties, and there was a girl in it who was really good. I mean, you know, you go, you know, you're at university, and some people have been to college, and, you know, there are some girls who are good and some are bad. You've probably seen those audiences on that, on Man with the Ridiculous Beard, Lipton show. You probably looked at them and thought, you know, when they asked Brad Pitt a question or something, you thought, God, I bet they're really terrible. You know, and Mr. Pitt, when you prepare for a part, you think, we're never ever going to see you on television. I always do, I don't know why. One day we'll see a biography of some great actor, and then we'll see them when they were a young student asking a question to Tom Hanks or one of those. But as far as I can tell, anyway, yeah, he's most people are crap, let's be honest. That's why it's such a ridiculously highly paid occupation. It is preposterously overpaid, and I'm very glad that it is. Even if you take your clothes off, you get paid. Sherlock Holmes, which I would urge you not to see. I take my clothes off in that. But this girl was something else. She was extraordinary. She was the same age as us. She was in a Stoppard play. It was a student production of Travesties by Tom Stoppard. And I remember looking down at the programme and I saw an image that said Emma Thompson, which is the most ordinary, meaningless name you can imagine. I said, who the hell was that? It was like Minerva being, you know, born fully armed. This was the complete thing, the whole package. And we became friends. We were reading the same subject, English literature, and it so happened we were in the same seminar group for I remember some seminar group on The Winter's Tale, and we became very good friends. We did plays together, and then in my second year, I wrote a play, which just happened to be a comedy, and because it was about my experiences as a teacher in the year after. No one knowing that I was actually on probation, having been in prison. I was a teacher at a prep school, and then went to Cambridge. And I wrote my experiences. It's a sort of satire. It's called Latin, it was put on at Edinburgh, and it won a prize. And I was very excited because I felt I'm a writer. It's what I'd always wanted to be. I'm a writer. I'd written the part for myself because I couldn't think of anyone else who could play the main part. There were two parts. So I was a sort of actor, but more excitingly, I felt I'm a writer, and especially because it won a prize. I felt winning writer. Emma had come to see it, and she introduced me to this rather tall man with red spots, a sort of rather flushy face and big blue eyes. And she told me his name, which I couldn't remember, and I said hello, and he went hello. And then at the beginning of our last year, Em came round to my room and she said, look, you've got to help Hugh write. He's absolutely desperate. You've got no one to write with. I said, who's Hugh? She said, I introduced you in Cambridge. You came round in Edinburgh. I introduced you. I said, oh. She said, well, he's president of the Footlights, which is like a comedy club. And you've got to write a review, and he thinks you should be a comedy writer because he saw that play. I said, oh, I was much more used to playing Shakespeare because, you know, when you're students, everyone's the same age, and obviously in plays, not everybody's the same age. So some people are good at playing young, and I was good at playing old. Tall, very deep voice, and so I go, you know, which is sort of all you need to be a Shakespearean. Or you can do the slightly more tenor Patrick Stewart version of the all sorts of Ian McKellen style. But basically, you know, there are various ways you can just be grand and Shakespearean. And so I was always the king in whatever the play was. Sometimes it was a good part, you know, and sometimes it was you just come on and bless the happy couple at the end. So I wasn't sure about this comedy business. I thought it was perhaps a bit beneath me, especially as I intended to stay on in Cambridge and get a doctoral thesis and quietly grow tweed in a corner and teach, become an academic, because as Shakespeare said, you know, young men sow wild oats and old men grow sage, and I'd sown my wild oats and I decided it was time to grow sage, but she persuaded me that this, so I went round to see this Hugh, and he was there with his girlfriend in his room. He was at his college in Cambridge, and I remember and I did sort of vaguely remember him. So yes, and he said hello, and I said hello, he said hello, and then he said, I've just been writing this, and he played a song, and I suggested a lyric change, and then he said, I've got this. And about 6 hours passed, and Hugh's girlfriend and Emma had been staring at us, as if they had witnessed Troilus meeting Cressida, Romeo meeting Juliet, and it was love at first sight. It wasn't, I'm glad to say, erotic love at first sight. It was comic love at first sight, which is a very odd sort of love at first sight. But it was as if it was like a collaborative, an instant collaborative relationship was formed. And so we wrote this stage show and this review, and which won a prize at Edinburgh and was put on television, and then just things happened. Hugh's ambition, which was to be a policeman in the Hong Kong, for some reason, Hong Kong Crown Colony. He read somewhere, I think he liked the idea of himself in priest, white shorts with probably iron, when we still owned Hong Kong, and he'd heard somewhere that the police force was corrupt, and I think he saw himself as a kind of Serpico going in, cleaning up the town. He has that slight Clint Eastwood thing to him, you must admit, and so we found ourselves professional actors, really, and the book covers that period, and it covers the period of my complete sort of I don't know what you would call it, addictions to things, really, and beginning with sugar, and you'll see there are a lot of things beginning with C that I was addicted to, and it ends with one of them. So it's sort of I'm afraid it ends with a ... So